and from Matthew, the 16th chapter, verses 13 through 20. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am, that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly warned the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the priests and the chief priests, elders, and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day he be raised. But Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get you behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on the divine things, but on human things." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Jesus looked at Simon Peter, Simon Bar-Jonah, said, "Simon, you are Petros or Cephas, the rock, and on this rock I will build my church." I've never built a church. In the 40-plus years of my pastoral ministry, the only major construction program I've ever had a hand in was a fellowship hall in Arcadia. The second biggest building program, second most expensive building program I've ever had a hand in was the recent renovations at the Manse here in Marianna. I think that was enough. I've been blessed to serve beautiful churches with buildings that were splendid. And notice that I made a differentiation between churches and buildings. I've never built a church. There was always a church there, a congregation, a solid, established, chartered, organized fellowship of Christians who operate under the banner of the Presbyterian brand of church. 3 different presbytery executives in 3 different presbyteries in 3 different decades tried to talk me into leaving the safe harbor of the church I was serving in order to start a new church, to build a congregation from scratch. In retirement with the security of a pension and Medicare, I might try that someday. At some place like Mexico Beach or Sandestin or Compass Lake, where there isn't a Presbyterian church. I think if we started one at Mexico Beach from Memorial Day to Labor Day, we might have more people there than we've got here. They'd be the same people, but if you were going to build a church, where would you start? Most of us, thinking as we do of the church as a building, would start with a piece of property, with real estate. And as quick as we could, we'd put a sign on the property, "Future home of the Presbyterian Church." And then we'd build a building just as quick as we could. And that's the way we used to do it. Our motto sounded like something from Field of Dreams. If we build it, they will come. But you know, that's not true anymore. I see churches, and not just Presbyterian churches, but other churches, I see them build buildings and try to start churches, and the next thing you know, that building's for sale. Or it's a restaurant, or an antique shop. Polly and I helped start a church in Manatee County, right on the Manatee-Sarasota County line at Lakewood Ranch. It's been 10 years since Polly and I helped what is now Peace Presbyterian Church get started. The Arcadia Church was one of the sponsoring congregations, and in the early days that church would worshiped on Sunday evening in a Lutheran church. And we would take our 2 church vans, a total of 30 people, ranging in age from over 100 to babes in arms, and we'd go over on Sunday evening and have church with the folks from Lakewood Ranch. And a lot of times there were more of us than there were of them. But we gave them that critical mass that made it feel like a worshiping community, and the next thing you knew, the church had called a pastor and things had taken off. And now that church is bigger than this church and bigger than the Arcadia Church. Pastor's been there 9 years, and she's doing a wonderful job. And it's a wonderful church. And when Polly and I finally do retire, when I quit doing this stuff that I do on Sunday, that's probably the church where I'm going to worship. They just bought a building, their first building after 9 years. It's a building complex, really, that another church built, started from another denomination, and it failed. So we went in and bought the building. They went in, bought the building. Well, I gave them a little money, so I guess I can say we. One of the most successful new church developments of the last 20 years is Riverside Church in Sterling, Virginia, in the Washington, D.C. area. That church began in 1997. Now that's 17 years ago. They still meet in a school. The babies born the year the church started will graduate from that school at the end of this year. They have actually spawned 2 or 3 other congregations, spun off from their church. Now their membership at 293 is only slightly larger than ours here, but their Sunday school attendance is 354. Now that's phenomenal. We couldn't accommodate 354 people for Sunday school. I'm not going to ask Mary Wireman what our average Sunday school attendance is, but I guarantee you it's not 354. 54? Not even that. Okay. Now their budget, let's talk about budget. Their budget is almost $750,000. And that's triple the budget of this church. Now, what kind of a rock is that church built upon? Jesus said he was going to build a church on Peter, the rock. Well, that church in Washington, D.C. area obviously isn't built upon the location of the building. And their spiritual leader, their pastor, Brian Clark, Brian's about that tall. He's bald. He's stout and short. You wouldn't pick him out of a lineup of half a dozen pastors as the one who's likely to head up the denomination's model new church development. But then if you were picking a leader to build a church in the time of Jesus, Simon Bar-Jonah wouldn't be the one you'd pick either. Now, he was big and he was strong, but to begin with, he was quick-tempered, impulsive, argumentative. He was always making rash statements that he couldn't back up. And instead of listening to Jesus, he often tried to tell Jesus what to do. Worst of all, Simon Peter was a fisherman. Now, you know about fishermen. They drive around in pickup trucks with a bumper sticker that says, "A bad day fishing is better than the best day at work." Fishermen tend to exaggerate. They tend to spend a lot of time out in the hot sun, and so they need to rehydrate often. And their beverage of choice is usually not bottled water or Gatorade. Fishermen work with fish. Fish are smelly. Therefore, fishermen are smelly. They smell like fish. They smell in and of themselves. We were talking this morning about the little boys. 5 minutes on the playground, and you can smell them when they come in the door of the church. They will grow up to be fishermen. If you were to build a church, you wouldn't start out with a bunch of fishermen. Why, they'd be out fishing on Sunday morning when they're supposed to be in church. Yet that is exactly what Jesus did. The first 4 disciples he recruited, Simon and his brother Andrew, James and his brother John, the sons of Zebedee, those are 2 sets of brothers, all fishermen. And these were not sport fishermen. These were hardcore commercial fishermen. They didn't wear Tommy Bahama shirts and Sperry Docksiders. They'd be dressed in ragged T-shirts and a pair of flip-flops. And those flip-flops would be held together with duct tape. Oh, I know, they didn't have T-shirts and flip-flops and duct tape in the days of Jesus and Simon Peter. But if they had, well, that's how it would have been. Now, why did Jesus pick Simon Bar-Jonah to be the one upon which he would build his church? The answer is so simple. It's all because Simon Peter knew who Jesus is. He recognized Jesus. He didn't call him Lord and Savior, but he called him the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And the disciples had several answers. One said, "John the Baptist." Well, John the Baptist was dead, beheaded at Herod's command as a prize for Salome's dance, so he could not be John the Baptist. Others said Elijah. Elijah, the greatest of the prophets, had been gone for centuries. But he hadn't died. Remember, he'd been taken up into heaven in a whirlwind in a chariot of fire, pulled by fiery horses. Elijah was a worker of miracles and a challenger of the established order of the day, both religious and political. And for any spiritual leader to be compared to Elijah was a compliment. Of course, in the tradition of Israel, several prophets in different eras might be called by the same name. At least 3 and probably 4 bore the name of Isaiah. So for there to be another called Elijah would mean that there was another great prophet abroad in the land. But Jesus wasn't Elijah. He wasn't just another prophet, even another great one. Some called him Jeremiah. Yet another great prophet who had spoken first of the new covenant, the new law that would be written on human hearts. Yes, Jesus preached like Jeremiah, but he wasn't Jeremiah. He wasn't one of the other minor, lesser prophets either. When Jesus asked, "Who do you say that I am?" Simon Bar-Jonah spoke the greatest truth of the gospel. He said, "You are the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus gave him his blessing. More than that, he gave him his new name, Peter, the rock upon which Jesus would build the Christian church. Now, the Roman Catholic Church lists Peter as the first pope, the first bishop of Rome. The book of Acts tells us of his leadership, his primacy in the early church. But before that, the Gospels tell us of his denial of Jesus and of that confrontation on the shore of the Sea of Galilee when Jesus asked Peter 3 times if he loved him. And on that rock, Christ built his church. What does it take to build a church? Not a sterling leader, not a piece of property, not a building, not perfect people. It takes people who firmly and with all their hearts and souls believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. They will still sin. They will still deny him by their words and by their actions. They will still fail him. But if they firmly, faithfully follow him, Christ will build his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Who is Jesus? He is the one who is the head of the church, who calls us to follow him, who calls us to be the church, and to him be the power, the glory, the dominion, and the praise in the church and in the world, now and forevermore.